It now gives me very great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, Professor Barney Glover, Order of Australia, Jobs and Skills Australia Commissioner. And our opening keynote is sponsored by Federation University, and we thank them for that. Professor Barney Glover began his 5-year term as Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia in April of this year. In this role, he is directly responsible and accountable to the Minister for Skills and Training. Professor Glover is a distinguished academic leader, an accomplished mathematician and mathematics educator with significant experience in developing strong relationships with the vocational education and training sector. He is well respected for his engagement with First Nations Australians and disadvantaged communities. He was Vice-Chancellor and President of Western Sydney University for 10 years, from 2014 to 2024, and in 2019 was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia for distinguished services to tertiary education, professional associations and cultural organisations. In 2015, Professor Glover was awarded the title of Emeritus Professor for his outstanding leadership whilst Vice-Chancellor of Charles Darwin University from 2009 to 2013. Professor Glover has served on the boards of a diverse range of corporate organisations and several state and national centres covering areas such as health and medical research, energy, mineral exploration and telecommunications. Thank you, Professor Glover. You have the podium. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. In my case, back in WA. I was at Curtin University for a number of years, so it's wonderful to be back here. And it's nice to be sponsored by Federation University, actually, which I don't think Federation University would remember it, but when it was the University of Ballarat, in fact, even before it was the University of Ballarat, I was there as a lecturer in mathematics and eventually chair of academic board and co-authored the first paper on merging TAFE with the university to form a dual sector institution at the University of Ballarat in the early 1990s. So it's nice to be back and associated with Federation University. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting today, the unceded lands of the First Nations people, to acknowledge their elders, past and present. I want to thank Auntie Frida for her presentation a little while ago in the Welcome to Country, particularly during a time as important as NAIDOC Week, for us to reflect on the contribution that we can make through tertiary education to First Nations people in this country, a theme I hope to come back to during the course of this presentation. Now, what I'd like to do is to give you a bit of insight into what JSA is doing. I know yesterday my great colleague Fan here was involved in giving you some workshops on some of our products that we're producing, so I'd like to just touch on the broad range of activities within JSA. I've been there for just 3 months, but I'm incredibly impressed with the work that JSA is doing. And I want to acknowledge the great work of NCVER and the great relationship we have. We rely heavily on the data from NCVER and the work of NCVER. And I also had an interesting relationship with NCVER, I should acknowledge. This is what happens when you're in the sector too long. Because while I was the Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney University, my Chancellor was Peter Shergold. And Peter, of course, Professor Peter Shergold AC, was also chair of NCVER during a part of that period. So Peter and I would talk often. In fact, I remember Simon Birmingham, when he was Minister, launching an NCVER conference, and I attended that alongside Peter Shergold. So wonderful to have the relationship. Well done to John for taking up the new role. Congratulations, looking forward to working with you. So I want to give you a bit of a sense of JSA, but I'm incredibly impressed with what I've seen in 3 months. I moved pretty quickly from being Vice-Chancellor at Western Sydney to being the JSA Commissioner. Didn't have a great deal of time in between, but in that 3 months since, I've been deeply embedded in the work of JSA and getting a sense of what it's doing, the breadth and the depth of what it's doing. So I hope you'll see some of that. And I'll only touch on elements of it in the course of this presentation. I want to leave a bit of time too to explore some of these themes in Q&A if we have time. I wanted to talk about our skills priority list. At the moment, we are about to finalise our 2024 skills priority list. And I should acknowledge, I know I've got JSC colleagues in this room from the Jobs and Skills Councils, so I want to acknowledge the JSCs. The architecture that the Minister referred to a little earlier in his presentation is a really important part, I think, of what the Albanese government is doing to focus attention on the importance of emerging trends in vocational education and training, in higher education, in the harmonisation of the system, and particularly in ensuring that we have a tripartite approach to the way in which we engage with business and industry, with government, state and federal and territories, as well as, of course, with unions representing employees, and then, of course, education and training providers. And the JSCs, incredibly important part of that architecture. So it's great to have JSCs in the room. And I think that architecture is beginning to really take shape. So I'm thrilled to be able to be here to talk to you from the JSA perspective, but only as part of that architecture, which I think we might like to talk about in some of our Q&A in a moment. Now, the skills priority list for 2024 is about to be finalised. So if you, as I'll show you now, for those who haven't followed the detail, of course, we saw quite a significant increase in the proportion of occupations that we are following, the 916 occupations that we follow. About 330 of them were in shortage in 2023, up considerably from 2022 and from 2021. A bit of a COVID artefact there, but we've come out of that, as the Minister referred to a moment ago, with serious skill shortages broadly in the economy. We're now at about 36% of our occupations are in shortage. And you get a sense of that here, and you can see professionals, technicians and trades workers in particular going up in terms of the proportion of occupations in those areas which are increasingly in shortage, 22 to 23. Now, we're finalising the 2024 list at the moment. To give you a little bit of insight into what we're seeing, for those of you who follow the trends in the labour market, you know we've seen some softening in the labour market, unemployment rising slightly. A lot of the work we do, we track a lot of information about what's happening in the labour market to complement and supplement the work of the ABS. From our perspective, we're beginning to see that softening trend continue. We're about to release our RIOS data in the next few days. Now, that's very much about recruitment difficulty through a business surveying instrument we use. Now, that's interesting. We've seen softening in recruitment difficulty over the course of the last 12 months. It's sort of plateaued off in the last 3 months, came up a little bit in May compared to April and March, but still trending overall downwards over that 12-month period. So we're seeing softening in the labour market, ease of recruitment improving. What that will mean is we'll likely see fewer occupations in shortage 2024 compared to 2023, but not dramatically so. So we'll see a little bit of shift of occupations out of shortage, but not dramatically. So that still shows we have a significant number of occupations in shortage. I also want to point out one of the other important pieces of work we do, and if you read the JSA Act, which I'm sure you all have done, it's a riveting read, but when you do read it again, you'll notice that it reinforces a number of very important principles about Jobs and Skills Australia as an agency. One of those principles is we are tripartite, which means we do, as I said a moment ago, we extensively consult on what we're doing, as do the JSCs at their industry-focused level. So for us, consultation is a key part of what we do, extensive consultation. We've just finished months of consultation on our work plan for the next 12 months. But importantly, there are other principles that we need to be conscious of in all the work that we do. One of them being that we are responsible for providing advice to government, as the Minister said, evidence-based, researched advice, pulling on the great data of NCVER. that will help government in its policy development with a focus on uplifting all Australians to reach their full potential in the labour market. So there's a very strong equity focus for the work of JSA, and particular the gender lens that we place on all the work that we do. And we do it in particular in relation to those skill shortage areas, particularly those skill shortage areas where we see gender imbalance, where we have gender skewed occupations. Not surprisingly, occupations where males make up at least 80% of the workforce, so male-dominated occupations. You can see 2023, 54% of male-dominated occupations are in shortage. 40% of female-dominated occupations are in shortage, but gender-balanced occupations, only 25% are in shortage. Now, that isn't Einsteinian, really, in its complexity. It's basically saying that if you're tapping into the full breadth of opportunity in the labour market, you've got a greater chance of avoiding shortages. But it does also shine a light on the importance of what gender imbalance is doing and how we, working again with the Jobs and Skills Councils at JSA, will be shining a light on those imbalances and providing advice on how we can address those imbalances. And I'll come back to that in a couple of the slides in a moment. So gender imbalance is an important part of our focus on skill shortages. I wanted to emphasise something that actually came up in my very first Senate estimates. For those who know a little bit about the joys of being a Commonwealth public servant, a relatively senior one, you do get to attend Senate estimates, which tends to be a huge amount of effort for an enormous amount of waiting for a few minutes of terror, and then you leave the room. That's just my assumption of what's going on. But during the moments of engagement with senators about Jobs and Skills Australia this year, there was a conversation about some of the work we're doing for the migration strategy at the moment. So we have been commissioned by the government to develop what's called the Core Skilled Occupations List, CSOL, as it's now affectionately known. CSOL is the core skilled component of the Skills in Demand visa that's been introduced under the new migration strategy, and it is for temporary employer-sponsored migration. Now, in order to be an occupation on CSOL, which provides enhanced opportunities to bring people into the country to address, in particular, skill shortages. To be on the list, of course, being an occupation in skill shortage is important. But the government also overlaid a second requirement. In fact, two other requirements, but one in particular. And that is that we needed to consider employment outcomes for migrants in those occupations. The argument being that if employment outcomes for migrants or for Australian workers are not positive, in other words, there is attrition and churn in those occupations, then those issues needed to be addressed by those peak bodies, those industry sectors, to address the nature of their workforce alongside of the opportunity to bring in skilled migration to address shortages. So that employment outcomes component was an important aspect of developing the CSOL list. It'll be out in about a month. At least it will be provided to the Minister in about a month. It'll be up to the Minister to release it when he has considered the advice, Minister Giles. But of course, it's based on the work of the skilled priority list. But I did want to emphasise, though, that employment outcomes are an important consideration for us. So we're looking at a lot of data at the moment to help inform our deliberations around occupations in shortage and what the employment outcomes might look like. But in responding to questions around CSOL at Senate estimates, the issue arose about, well, surely if there's a skill shortage, it should just be on the CSOL list. But skill shortages arise for a number of reasons. So JSA has been doing some great work on what we call our skill shortage typology, based on some work of Sue Richardson from South Australia. And this is the JSA version of it at the moment. We're continuing to update this work. But what it's saying essentially is there are four areas broadly that contribute to skill shortage. Now, 2 of them relate to training gap problems. You know, we may have a long training gap problem. We've got a shortage, but it actually takes a bit of time in the domestic labour supply to uplift the skills and the qualifications of people to participate and address that shortage. So we have some long training gap challenges. We also have some short training gap challenges, a little easier to address when you're in times of skill shortage, because you might be able to more quickly bring people through qualified with the right credentials, the right skills to contribute to those occupations in shortage. There's some examples of that in the second column. The third column and the fourth column, they relate to 2 other really important characteristics of shortage. One is what we call the suitability gap. This is where, from our perspective, the labour supply side of suitably qualified applicants seems to be adequate to meet demand, but yet it's not meeting demand. And when you drill down on it, you often find a mismatch between the expectation of employers and the skills and attributes of the labour market, of the workforce, that we believe should be eligible for the jobs in shortage. So we have a suitability gap. Something's happening here. Perhaps there's not enough conversation between industry and vocational education and training providers, TAFE, universities, about the skills they really need and when they need them. Perhaps there's a lack of work experience, perhaps there's a lack of work-integrated learning, perhaps there's a whole range of a lack of co-design of curriculum. There might be a range of things contributing to the suitability gap, and consequently that's leading to shortage. The fourth area is retention gap, which touches on the issues I mentioned earlier about CSOL. The retention gap issue really relates to, well, we seem to have a reasonable supply side opportunity, but there is high levels of attrition in this particular set of occupations, and you see people moving into and out of those occupations relatively quickly. So there are a series of questions to ask about the nature of those particular occupations, the working conditions, the financial incentives, and so on. We're just about to complete a very important study. We do what are called capacity studies. We'll come back to them a little later. One that we're about to finish is the Early Childhood Education and Care study, the EC study, which we're doing with Human Ability, one of the great jobs and skills councils. And very important core to the work of Human Ability, very important sector when we look at the feminised and male-dominated workforces that we need to address opportunities for people to be able to meet job opportunities right broadly in the economy. ECEC focused on early career workers, early childhood workers and early childhood educators and early childhood centre managers, is showing that we do have a problem here with retention, with people moving in and out. We've got demand and we want to see that demand increase because we want more women particularly to have an opportunity, parents to have an opportunity for their children to be in affordable childcare, and there are many state and territory and federal government policies to drive that, but we certainly need a workforce ready and trained to meet that need, but they need to be in a workplace where they can see longer term career opportunities, career development, proper remuneration, proper working conditions, and so on. So that's a good example of retention gap challenge. So skill shortage is not automatically skilled migration is the solution to a skill shortage. It's part of the solution, particularly temporary employer-sponsored short-term migration is certainly part of the solution, but we need to consider these issues in the longer term. And I want to touch on just a couple of examples of what is happening to address these sorts of issues in the labour market. I wanted to mention the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, which is doing some extraordinary work. Gab Traynor is chairing this. She also chairs Build Skills, co-chairs the Board of Build Skills, one of our great JSCs. And I was very impressed when I got a briefing on the work of the Construction Industry Culture Task Force, because of the work they're doing to develop a culture standard to address truly a retention issue in the construction industry. So it's not about skill migration as the solution necessarily, it is about changing the nature of the workplace in the construction industry in Australia and the culture of that workplace. And could there be a mechanism to bring about culture change? So this gives you a sense of that and the work they're doing. They're focusing on the culture standard they developed, the draft one, which has been out for some time now for consultation, health and wellbeing, diversity and inclusion, and work-life balance, time for life, and looking at and embedding the culture standard in procurement arrangements for major sort of tier 1, tier 2 construction projects in Australia. But the most important bit, I think, has been the success of their six big pilot programs. And I know they're producing an interim report is out now on those 6 pilot projects. There'll be a full report later in the year with a lot more of the quantitative data, but the early information from the interim report is showing that you can make a difference here. This is a very busy slide, and I'm sure we can make the slide pack available for people who'd like to see these in more detail. But this just describes the culture standard and the components of it: inclusive workplaces, targeting diversity, remuneration, flexibility, mental health, managing health risks, health programming, and for the trials introducing some work periods. You know, they were very conscious of the long working hours and the inflexibility in the construction industry, so all of the pilots had restrictions on the number of hours that someone could work and the number of days off they had to have. And of course then to look at how does that affect productivity, how does that affect the completion of a project, how does that affect literally the health and wellbeing of those in the construction industry. Well, the interim report is showing at the moment qualitatively, but I'm sure quantitatively as well, you get a sense of it, it's not impacting on productivity. If anything, you're seeing a much healthier, much more engaged workforce. And I think some of the big tier 1 construction companies are going to embed this into their work in an ongoing way. It's a great example of an industry sector responding to a culture challenge and a retention challenge. And hopefully we'll begin to see the implications of that over what will be a very, very, very exciting period for the construction industry as we move to net zero, because a lot of the next decade is about building things and construction. I want to talk a little bit about suitability gap as well, because that touches on a lot of you here who are in the vet sector. And I know the theme here is about partnerships, and I want to talk about that and how crucial that is to changing the nature of the relationship between industry and education and training within the context of a national skills system. I want to talk about a couple of examples of this. This just happens to be an example of a degree apprenticeship program being developed by AI Group with RMIT in systems engineering. It's an apprenticeship in the context of being a earn while you learn model. So a lot of the learning goes on in the workplace. There's a certain amount of time in the context of the university, but equally a lot of time working in the workplace, being employed by an employer, and a lot of co-design of this sort of degree apprenticeship model between industry and an industry peak body with the AI Group, and in this case a dual sector provider. So it brings in the fact that we need to develop programs that pick up in the vet sector and move through into higher education. And I know that some of our JSCs are looking at this sort of more integrated vocational and higher education program to address particular challenges in their industry sectors. I wanted to give it as an example of partnership to bring about a different form of degree qualification with an earn while you learn component to it, directly related to the challenges of retention and suitability. Now, the next example was a series of things I wanted to pick up on. The Minister mentioned some of this because it does come back to partnerships. If we want to address suitability in particular, it is about partnership. It is about industry working closely with vocational education and training and higher education. These are just 3 models that I think are worthy of note, and I think they indicate, the last slide had in it the words tertiary harmonisation. We're involved in a body of work at the JSA looking at what tertiary harmonisation might mean. What does it mean to have a more joined up tertiary education system in this country? That isn't one sector overwhelming the other. It's about a parity of esteem between our two sectors, our vet sector and our higher education sector within a tertiary system. But how do we make these two sectors work even more effectively together? How do we make that harmonisation work? These models coming out of New South Wales, the IATs, the Institutes of Applied Technology, came out of a Shergold-Gonski report a few years ago on the vet system in New South Wales. Two of them in operation at the moment. One is digital skills involving New South Wales TAFE, Macquarie University, UTS, Microsoft and some other big partners. It's a great example of a new sort of degree program, micro skills, micro credentials, co-design, partnership, upskilling, reskilling. It's got all the right words associated with it, and also a very impressive new piece of infrastructure in Meadowbank in Sydney. Second one is IAT Construction, which is in Penrith, Kingswood on the western edge of Sydney. It's an association with Western Sydney University where I was. Again, a very significant investment in infrastructure, very, very significant large industry partner working with TAFE New South Wales. Again, the same characteristics. Very good early take-up. But at the moment, the business model for these is not well developed about how do we make these things work in an integrated way alongside the sort of challenges between the two sectors actually bumping into each other instead of seamlessly working together. The Minister's announced the first two TAFE Centres of Excellence. I think that's a model very much similar at the national level to the TAFE IATs, EVs, and of course clean energy here in WA. There's more to come. I think they're another good model. It's going to be important not only to look at each of those individually as great partnership models. I think they'll work closely with the JSCs, but there also need to be a network around Australia so that this is a really important and powerful suite of partnerships to drive real change in training packages. They'll be self-accredited for some AQF levels in higher education. As a minister, that will be piloted in TAFE Centres of Excellence, and they may very well get allocations of Commonwealth supported places. So they're really taking TAFE to the next level of engagement in that higher education context. And of course, regional university study hubs, which are now regional study hubs and metropolitan study hubs, part of the Accord. I was on the Accord working group. I think they're now involving or will be involving TAFE more. Again, a great model of partnership. So those two examples, degree apprenticeships and these, were all to say we're thinking about tertiary harmonisation to address suitability gaps, to address skill shortages, so we have the workforce we need. I'll come back to the shape of our workforce in a moment because it is challenging when we map it to the future and the sort of profile we need now from people leaving, moving into post-secondary education and what sort of needs we'll have in the economy in the long term. But this sense of greater cohesiveness between vocational training and higher ed is a theme that the Accord picked up on. And I just wanted to pick a couple of quotes out of the Accord which made the point that more cohesiveness, more connectedness, more collaboration between our sectors. This is not to say it's not happening, by the way. It is happening. These examples highlighted it. It's just not systematic and it's not enabled and it's not as easy as it should be. And we need to ensure that it can become much easier and to recognise that phrase, parity of esteem, across our two sectors, and importantly, to influence those people who help young people to make decisions about their life choices when it comes to career opportunities, so that we see a balance in some of the expectations of people in relation to future career opportunities. So the Accord had a lot to say about it. I don't want to dwell on this a great deal, but it touches on some of the system shifts that JSA will be, we hope, supporting that are necessary to help us move towards a more aligned, more cohesive, more joined up tertiary education system. There's a lot of sensitivity about this because no one wants to see a fully integrated system where we lose the characteristics of vocational education and training, which are so vital, nor the characteristics of universities. So it's a sensitive area to talk through. We've got to focus on what the benefits are, but also to delineate where we want to apply some of these policy instruments. So this is just some of them from the Accord: a cohesive and connected system, more flexibility, more responsiveness to the skills system, supporting more people to upskill and reskill, lifelong learning, the right skills mix and addressing skill shortages at the right time, expanding opportunity for all. There's an equity element here. As you probably know, the Accord and the government's accepted the Accord's attainment target for 2050 for Australia, which is 80% of the workforce to have post-secondary qualifications, tertiary qualifications, of which about 55% would be higher ed. I think that the 80% is the right number. The mix higher ed, vet and those who have both needs to be thought through a little bit more, but the overall aim is very clear. One of the bits of data we often quote at the JSA is that within a decade, 92% of all new jobs will require post-secondary education, tertiary education, 92%. At the moment, it's 70%. So we're moving from 70% of jobs requiring it to 92%. And that's just new jobs. Then you've got the wave of people going through the workforce in a lifetime way who need to be upskilled and reskilled, as well as those entering with new skills. And of course, there's infrastructure that's needed. And this is where the NCVER and JSA come into play with the ABS, and that is we need to have the great data, great metrics. We need to be able to understand what's happening, how we can drive efficiency and effectiveness. One of our responsibilities under the JSA Act is to make recommendations on the adequacy of the vet system to meet the jobs and skills of the future, which is where the relationship with NCVER becomes absolutely crucial. Good data requires integrated data assets, and Fan spoke yesterday about Vander as one of those and the work we're doing. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Person-level integrated data assets with the ABS are hugely powerful tools to help us understand what's happening as we integrate income support data with ATO data, with NCVER data, with our own data, in ways that with HIMSS data and PRISM's data. These integrated data sets are extraordinarily powerful in telling us what's happening, what's working, how effective is it, and where are the areas of real challenge. And I wanted to mention the new Australian Tertiary Education Commission, which I am on the Implementation Advisory Committee for at the moment as we work through what does an ATEC look like. It's got T, tertiary, in the title, and tertiary harmonisation is one of its responsibilities. So that's another piece of the architecture that's going to be important as we try and see what a joined-up tertiary system might look like, and to map that all the way back to let's address those skill shortages and address our sovereign responsibility to uplift all Australians to participate in the workforce. That expanding opportunity for all is vital because we can't hit any of our targets domestically unless we have opportunities for equity groups who are underrepresented in post-secondary education to be more engaged and to contribute in a very positive way to that future. Now, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of other bits of this puzzle, the work of JSA, but I want to try and wrap it back around to why we have a particular challenge at the moment. We do a lot of work on 10-year employment projections. An important part of our forward-looking aspect of JSA, our workforce futures work that we do. So we have a body of work that is understanding the current labour market. We have a body of work that's looking at workforce futures, shaping the workforce of the future, as well as fostering participation, inclusive participation in the labour market, and also optimising the system. They're the pillars of work that JSA is involved in. So we do some quite significant economic modelling, labour market economic modelling of jobs of the future. Now this is the 2033 model. We're about to release the 2034 model, which will be a little different because we're trying to take into account some challenges with what this is telling us. As you can see, it's showing that the professionals category is going to grow dramatically. This first slide is in hundreds of thousands of new jobs over the next decade. You can see the growth there, other growth less significant over the course of the next decade. So professionals will grow dramatically. If we look at it in terms of size of the labour market, the jobs market by industry sector, it's a busy slide. It's trying to compare what things will look like in a decade, 2033, compared to what they look like now, and splitting it between the purple, which is the service industries, and the green, which is in the producing industries. So for any government, you've got to get a balance right here. We're going to see, based on a whole range of assumptions, a lot of growth in healthcare and social assistance, professional, scientific and technical services, retail trade, education and training. And you can see, particularly at the top, significant growth in the proportion of the labour market in that healthcare and social assistance category. Now that's what our model is saying to us at the moment, but we are cautious about this for a couple of reasons. And it comes back to the question about how do we meet the skill shortages now and into the future? How do we ensure we don't have retention gaps and suitability gaps? How do we uplift for participation broadly in the labour market of the future? We have a mismatch at the moment between the educational profile of young people entering post-secondary education and the educational profile that we need to address what Treasury would be saying are the big investment trends of the future. Take one example, housing and construction, dwelling construction. 1.2 million homes to be built. If you look at Treasury's data on that, it has a couple of years as we get started, then ramps quite dramatically. Well, we do need tradespeople, but this model is not showing us that growth in those particular sectors. So we need to be thinking about how do we, in my view, go back into schools. It's going to be about uplifting vet in schools. It's going to be uplifting careers advice in schools. It's going to be uplifting opportunities for young people to have alternative pathways in schools. It is going to be to find ways to lift aspiration. One of the bits of data that Jason Clare quotes a lot, which troubles me enormously, is that we've dropped from 90% of young people completing Year 12 to 79%. So 90% to 79%. That's troubling. That's about aspiration. We don't want anyone to be left behind. We in fact have to uplift many parts of the economy, many parts of society which are educationally and socially disadvantaged. So for us, this is a big challenge into schools and a big challenge to ensure that we are not just focused on one end of the educational spectrum, but broadly. And this starts to tell us, when we show you our 2034 projections, we'll be doing more scenario analysis to try and better illustrate what's happening if we don't make some changes and we don't see some of those male-dominated industries that are more feminised, that we don't see some changes in culture in workplaces, if we don't see ourselves managing our migration system very, very carefully. So that's some of the work we're doing. It's very exciting, it's very important work for us right at the moment. Now, I want to talk about a couple of things which are very technical at one end of the spectrum, but incredibly powerful, and I've touched on them already, and that's our integrated data assets and the work that we're doing. I wanted to mention the RTO typology. There was a workshop on this yesterday. This is an example of what we're doing by pulling from the BLADE data in the ABS and other data sets to have a look if we can better classify RTOs, to better understand the characteristics of those subsets of RTOs in the system and how we can better cluster them for the purposes of understanding how adequate our vet system really is. And so that paper is out for consultation at the moment. We're expecting to get some very valuable feedback from those RTOs and those in the vocational education and training system and universities more broadly. But it is a very important piece of work if we can better understand, at least at a cluster level, not an individual RTO level, but a cluster level, what's happening in vocational training to give great outcomes into the future. So that's an example of the new segmentation we're looking at. We're looking for feedback on it. It might sound highly technical, but it's not. It's fundamental to getting the structure right and understanding the adequacy of our system. VANDA. I love VANDA. And VANDA is the VET National Data Asset. Big integrated data set. It will expand beyond VET. I'm not sure what we'll call it when we do the V's good, VANDA's good. It rolls off the tongue. I'm sure we'll invent another acronym. But one little example of this I wanted to give was some of the work that Fan and her colleagues have been doing around apprenticeships versus non-apprenticeship Cert 3s. Now, this was data that we put together to support Ian Ross and Lisa Paul doing their review of apprenticeships. That's due to be finalised in the next few months. I think for all of us in this room, we'll be very interested in the outcome of that. What we had a look at is, well, there are a number of Cert 3s where you have both an apprenticeship pathway and a non-apprenticeship pathway. And we were interested in knowing, does that make any difference to some of the outcomes for people? Median income uplift, pre and post qualification, and understanding whether people remain in their relevant occupations. And as this data illustrates, it's just one sort of data set, illustrates apprenticeships in the model that you imagine of an apprenticeship, certainly a superior product when it comes to delivering uplift and staying in the profession. So it's one piece of data that we've fed through to the review. It's complicated data though. I wanted to emphasise it's quite complicated. This is not clean data by any stretch of the imagination. And our data analysts need to do a great deal of work to try and unravel some of the complexity of it to come up with some fairly interesting analysis. And I think this is helpful on one subset of apprenticeships where you've got this ability to track through different modalities. Now, Vanda's going on to do a whole lot of additional work, which I'm sure with the support of NCVER and ABS and others will be of great value. We've done the 2017-2018 work on the top 100 vet quals, looking at what happens before and after, looking at by equity group, all of that. We're doing a little bit more work on the 2017-2018 data. We're about to do the 2019-2020 data. Then we'll fall into this COVID world. We'll have to work our way through it. But we're going to give more and more detailed information about how we can track through those vet quals to understand what difference it makes, median income, medium uplift of income, further study in higher education, what happens by equity group, what happens by state and territory. So you can see some of the work that is mentioned there. Students who completed a qual for 2019-20. We're going to be looking a little bit at what happens if they don't complete. A lot of discussion around what a non-completer means in vet. You know this better than I do, but I ran a dual sector university for 5 years. Don's over there keeping an eye on me, Don Zollner. And we knew Don. We had a lot of non-completers in the Northern Territory, but that didn't mean by any measure that they hadn't actually achieved exactly what they wanted. They had got the competency they needed. They might have been working in a remote community and they needed to know how to maintain the diesel generator. Fair enough. They don't need every competency, but they needed that one in Cert 2 in essential services or whatever, or rural operations. We need to be careful about how we assess our completions data. We want to look at that question in more depth. And a fan will be great at finding a way to do that through a whole lot of complicated data. Because it is complicated data, but it's very, very important. And we want to look at a whole range of other parameters we can bring in beyond just equity and priority groups, looking at location, part-time work status, caring arrangements, bringing that into the Vanda data, and what contributes to remaining in employment as an important part of that. This is a really important part of the work JSA does, getting it out there in the public domain, getting your feedback on it, refining it, developing it, and hopefully influencing, and I know it does influence, policymakers, particularly in our Commonwealth Government and states and territories. My interactions with all the ministers at state and territory level, I'm meeting the WA Minister this afternoon, those interactions are incredibly positive about the work that we are doing to try and provide as much information at the state and territory level as we can, and also at the regional level. So we're now looking at how we can disaggregate some of our data down to SA4 level, and it may even be possible to go beyond SA4. I wanted to plug a few of the things that we have released recently if you haven't seen them. The Clean Energy Generation Capacity Study last year was the first under the JSA umbrella. Has been widely accepted and I think has been influential on a whole range of impactful decisions of the Commonwealth around clean energy in the last budget. And showing there are 38 critical occupations, for example, in the clean energy net zero future, and very substantial shortages in those occupations if we don't act quickly. 32,000 more electricians that we need, for example, just in the clean energy space alone. Food supply chain capacity study we're doing at the moment. That will be completed, I think, in about 2 months' time. Again, a lot of consultation going on around the workforce challenges in the food supply chain. There's a lot of migration issues there as well with palm and working holiday maker visas. So it's a complicated area, some great work going on there. I mentioned ECEC. That is due to be released in the next few weeks. There'll be a very public release of that report. I hope people have a look at its recommendations. They're very powerful recommendations, and I hope government will pick those up, and I think they will in some cases. We've done a lot of work for the VET blueprint for Department of Education and Workplace Relations. So we're doing some VET workforce data as well as working on some analysis around the VET First Nations workforce. So a continuing body of work I think we'll be doing into the future. We have about to complete an interim report on international student pathways and outcomes. This is very topical with all the concerns about caps on universities and vocational education training providers around international students at the moment. And this was a study that we commenced in response to that to have a look at, well, let's try and track a cohort and see what happened to them as they move through post-study work rights into the Australian labour market and what are the comparative advantages and challenges and the contributions they're making. So we're looking forward to that. Again, data is our challenge here, getting the right data sets to help us in that regard. And we have commenced a very important study over the next 18 months, our foundation skills work. This is the first nationwide adult literacy and numeracy and digital literacy study that has happened in Australia for over a decade. It is part of a potential lead into the international space with Australia rejoining PEAC, if PEAC goes ahead in 2026 and 2029. But we need some baseline data here in Australia, so that's a big study. It has a subsidiary study, a very important one, feasibility study around, which we call Murtu Yungalan, which is to work with First Nations people about how we actually design a survey around First Nations people and adult literacy, numeracy and digital literacy, particularly in a regional and remote context. So that work very, very importantly going on. And what JSA presentation would be complete without pictures of our studies so that you don't forget them. Some of them not even out yet, food supply and early childhood, but they are soon to be released. Hopefully you'll have an opportunity to see the depth of work we're doing. If we look ahead, just to give you a sense of, we're finalising our work plan at the moment. It's a very comprehensive work plan for JSA for the next 12 months. We're looking at generative AI as an area that we'll do some work over the next 12 months, given what's happening in the labour market around Gen AI and interesting things being said about it. Tech Council report last week. LinkedIn did a report earlier this year. It's interesting data that we'll have a look at and look at a study in that space. We're going to do more work on gender in the next 12 months in particular. We're doing some scoping work on Future Made in Australia because of its importance broadly in the economy. We'll do some work in that space, as well as some scoping work for priority groups and engagement in the labour market. So it will be, as I understand it, as busy next year as next year. I say next year, we're actually in the financial year that I'm talking about, as any other year for JSA. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions.